Acton. Welcome to Red Femmes.
Hi, George. Welcome.
What are we doing this week?
We are introducing this podcast. It's called Red Femmes, as in well-read.
Sounds like a play on words, though. Doesn't it sort of sound like rad, like radical feminist?
Are we radical feminists?
Are we even feminists?
We will get to that shortly. We can say right off the bat that we'll be reading texts that relate to all things women.
I think the format we're going to do is we're going to look at one or two, depending on how long they are, contemporary, recent texts, and then maybe talk about something that we've read in the past, well, we've read again, because we're that good, and how it relates.
Awesome. Sounds fun.
All right, what's the title?
Economic Sex, the Fatal Flaw of Second Wave Feminism.
Ooh. So we're talking about Evan Illich, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's perfect for episode 1. I think you are the only other person I've met, Acton, who's actually read his collection of essays called Gender. I am totally obsessed.
I know. Easy, George. We got a plan. First things first.
Okay. First things first, the section where we do lead-off Q&A. So we have 2 questions that are very appropriate for the first episode of this show. And they are, what does feminism mean to you? And how has that meaning changed since you were younger?
All right. Well, I consider myself to be very fortunate in that I was raised in an environment that was so loving and supportive that for the most part, I was pretty oblivious to the kinds of issues that feminism has developed in response to. So,
such as?
Well, all my grandparents, all my parents and aunts and uncles, they've all celebrated their 50th wedding anniversaries, and I grew up watching like really happy and cooperative relationships between my parents and my other relatives. And I had a father who always encouraged my intellectual interests, and my mom stayed home with us when we were little. And I remember just the wonderful feeling of coming home from school and having tea time with her and, playing with her. She was the kind of mom who would sing to us and do plays on words and do pillow forts with us and read to us. And she always conveyed this sense that she wouldn't want to be anywhere else, that this was, being a mom was like the best thing that happened to her. And as we got older, she went back to work. She's a musician, a pianist, but when we were older, she went to work in the school system with disabled kids, and she was wonderful at it. But because of how I was raised, I grew up with this really deep and abiding optimism about the relationship between the sexes, about the goodness of family, the joy of being a mom, about the likelihood of being supported in whatever profession I chose. Like, I never really had any anxiety about, I might want to do something and I wouldn't be able to because I'm a woman. Like, that literally never occurred to me. And I also just had all these assumptions that I'd be able to marry a good man and we'd stay married and it would be fine. It'd be great. And so I was really lucky. I was able to marry my best friend when I was 20, and now my marriage is older than I was when I entered into it.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. I've got 4 kids whom I love. I get to do work that I love that fits in really seamlessly with being a wife and a mother and a homeschooler. And so in a sense, I kind of feel like a poster child of beating the odds, that, that my life is kind of an example of how a modern woman can, like, if everything goes right, like externally speaking, it can be great. And so I feel really lucky. I guess that's what privilege is. So yeah, I'm checking my privilege.
I was like, yep, she's doing
that's what I
gotta do. She's getting her bona fides.
So I'm getting that other way.
Don't hate me because I'm fortunate.
Exactly. Thank you. So I come to feminism from a place that's incredibly hopeful, probably idealistic, and really family friendly. So it's been very eye-opening the older that I get and the more that I read to learn what life is like for women who have not been blessed with really good men throughout their lives, who've suffered from discrimination or abuse or abandonment. And I've been lucky to have been surrounded by good men from birth. So I'm a male-loving feminist, and I don't make sweeping judgments against men in general. I'm more of an old-school, first-wave feminist in the vein of Mary Wollstonecraft, in that I think the problems that feminism seeks to address are ultimately solved through virtue and cooperation on the part of both sexes, even if systemic issues make that really difficult. So if a conservative Christian were to ask me, are you a feminist? I would say yes, because in that context, which is the background that I'm from, I want to advocate for equality and respect for women within marriage and within the church, because some parts of evangelicalism have done women a grave disservice by preventing them from being able to teach and use their gifts, as well as making the assumption that all women should desire and should achieve marriage and children. And that is just not the life path that all women have or want. And there's also an ugly underbelly in evangelicalism, which will, praise, yes, that kind of praises smoking hot wives and Etsy moms and submissive biblical womanhood, whatever that means, while shaming single women for having cats and treating them like they're the leftovers, or making childless women feel like failures. And that makes me really angry. So, and I've also just seen too many imploding marriages amongst Christians, and infidelity, emotional abuse, women being sidelined, to feel like I could say, oh, the church is fine. We don't need feminism, because we do. We definitely do. But if a liberal Democrat, which probably describes most of our town, were to ask,
"Are you a feminist?"
We live. We're anonymous. It's a blue space, shall we say? If someone local were to ask, "Are you a feminist?" I would probably say no, because I'm against abortion, except in extremely rare situations. I'm against porn. I think divorce is a tragedy. I believe marriage is meant for one man and one woman for life. I think being a mother is a beautiful gift, and that children are not a burden. I love men and masculinity, and I don't think that trans women are women. So, plenty of progressive...
She's getting us canceled, and we're not even 5 minutes into the show!
I'm sorry. It's over.
It's over. Goodbye.
So plenty of progressive feminists would find me way too traditional to be in their club. So am I a feminist? Yes and no. Depends on who's asking, I guess.
That was awesome. And Acton's not a real name. Who is Acton Bell the pen name for? I want to say I'm going to make... do I want to make a mistake on air?
One of the sisters.
Does it violate my PhD? It was one of the Brontes, though, right?
One of the Brontes,
okay.
Yes. I don't know which one.
Okay. So I think that's probably true for me, too. I mean, it does depend who you ask, because I think it's not a coincidence that website raising the alarm about the prevalence of adolescent females suddenly believing they're all boys, they called it the woman called it fourth wave now. And with that, she's saying we need a fourth wave of feminism, a wave of feminism that counters some of these things that certain people, including you, including me, find dangerous about so-called third wave feminism. And of course, third wave feminism comes from second wave feminism, which we're going to talk about a lot today. So I was definitely raised in what we could call a second wave feminism awareness household. I was definitely had the awareness that expectations for women had been limited by being a woman. As recently as my mother's own childhood, she would say that when she was growing up, it was just understood that a woman could aim to be 4 things professionally: a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, or a social worker. In fact, my mother was a social worker, although my father was too. She knew she wanted to do something that involved her intellect more, but it was only when she was, in her early 30s that she was like, okay, I'm going to go to law school. And so she did that when I was a kid. She became a lawyer, and it was because she couldn't have done it before, because she just didn't have the confidence. She didn't have it wasn't just this thing that you went off and did, and now it's like, we know that, women... We don't have that problem anymore about, not going to college. They outnumber men in college now, and in many graduate fields as well. So that kind of sexism that I associate very strongly with second wave has disappeared. The sexism the bigotry of low expectations, we could maybe call it, in the sense that we don't even say... When I grew up, I remember saying women doctor or women lawyer, because it was like unusual. I mean, it was like a thing. You noted it, right? And, of course, that's not the same as the workplace everything being hunky-dory in the workplace. I think getting the job and having the job are two different things, and we're also going to talk about that. Definitely this idea that feminism was about not just counting women out because they were women. Mm-hmm. And, but for me, I think it was personally, I never had this idea that that men and women were ever going to be the same. I didn't even have any male friends, I think, until my 30s.
Really?
Yeah, I just didn't...
Wow.
Well, I didn't have a lot of friends, period, for a lot of that. But anyway, I knew that relating to men and relating to women was I never felt like they were just... I never had this idea that it was just people were people. I had a very distinct sense that boys and girls are different. I had a camp counselor once who would throw a Frisbee and we'd all try to catch it. And there was this situation where and he would be like, oh, extra points if you dive. And this kid, like, I mean, he's a kid now, right? Because he must have been, like, maybe in his late teens, maybe his early 20s. I mean, because he was a camp counselor and I was a kid. And I wrote him a letter to say it was sexist to assume that girls could just as easily dive for his Frisbee. Because, like, boobs.
Because boobs. Yes.
And that was the feminism that I grew up with. Is like, don't frame something as, don't exalt something without an awareness of, the differences that might apply to that exaltation. Like, you can't, we're not all the same.
Right.
So you might want to, and this isn't something a guy's going to think of.
No, I bet
he's never had that experience. Oh yeah. And it was like, I don't think that's just, that's a product of, okay, if we have this attitude that girls and boys are the same, we're going to find ourselves in cul-de-sacs like that.
Yes.
Then in graduate school, I went through an angry woman, Catherine McKinnon phase. She is one of these, she's a legal scholar, and she talked about about these sort of core, what we could call like sort of core feminist issues, this anger about violence against women, about the deep current of misogyny that exists and that remains in our culture, about like, it was not very popular to, has it ever been popular to be against porn? I don't know. But I was never very convinced that the state or the law could ever really accomplish the liberation from male violence. I guess the phrase, the liberation of women from the patriarchy, that was the heart at a lot of this kind of sort of very activist, very angry feminism. I remember taking a class on Italian feminism in grad school and thinking, and I think it was a moment of cognitive dissonance, really, because here we are, a bunch of women who had feminist convictions in the sense that we wanted rights for women, but we're all, like, most of us were straight, and it was just really clear that heterosexuality wasn't something, and isn't something, that most women are prepared to abandon in the name of any kind of female solidarity.
Right.
It doesn't mean I'm not glad that women have legal rights. I mean, especially in the Italian case, we were dealing with a country that was very Catholic, and, you didn't have a right to divorce or to abortion. Or to lesbian marriage or any of those things. But at the same time, okay, so great. Those rights now exist in Italy, but the law clearly has limits. For me, feminism isn't about the law. I mean, it is and it isn't, right? So, okay, Roe has fallen. So the law can change. So if you put your faith in the law to protect you, well, the law can change. Also, like, a lot of people didn't talk about this while Roe was in existence, but Roe did not guarantee abortion access. It completely varied by state. It was really not... something being legal is not the same as it being accessible. And we saw that, I mean, the fact is that when Roe fell, a lot of the numbers, the places where abortion was now illegal were places where it was almost inaccessible anyway.
Right.
If access is your issue, the law, I don't think, really helped. Even Roe didn't really help. Because it's a cultural, I would say it was a cultural thing. Another example of the law having limits is pornography. I'm a liberal, but I am against porn because I don't see any redeeming aspects of it to society. And I know that the people, it's always worse for women. It's a classic example. It may be the classic, prostitution would be the other one. So laws can change, and then we can also see that, pornography in America is considered free speech. I mean, we used to have obscenity laws, which I think was crazy because that meant you couldn't say, like, the F word in a club, which seems and probably is ridiculous. But if you're going to justify, 12-year-olds being able to find porn on YouTube because it's free speech, you've lost me there.
Yeah. And
so we can't even touch that issue in law here. We don't even have the tools. So that means there has to be other tools.
Yeah.
And of course, being against porn is viewed as not feminist. So on Twitter, first moment of shameless self-promotion.
Do it.
My handle is read my Substack, which people have told me, I can't believe that wasn't taken. I'm like, yeah, okay.
You got it.
I got it. I call myself a harbinger feminist.
What's that?
So there's a marketing term called harbinger customer, which they've apparently all the, now that everybody has their little, customer card, they're able to do so much data analysis on what you buy. And it turns out that there is type of customer who has a pattern of buying new products that then are not popular. And
what does that say about you?
As soon as I heard that term, I was like, oh my God, that's me. Because I will go to the store and be like, this is the best product ever. And then 6 weeks later, God. Most recent thing that happened with was the Trader Joe's 100% cacao chips. They're chocolate chips that have no sugar in them. They're so good. Anyway,
I don't know about that.
Gone.
You lost me.
Good, gone. So I don't expect to be popular. So I'm an unpopular feminist because as we're going to talk about, I think that culture really matters. I feel like we've both experienced. I got married a lot later than you did. I've only been married about 8 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a large component to feeling like, oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with marriage and these things when they go well for you.
Yeah.
I mean, that I think is just a natural human tendency to be. It's a natural bias to your own, but we're both sort of in a happy man bubble.
Right. Yeah, a good man makes an enormous difference in your perspective on
yes, and also just having my parents are still married.
Yes.
My aunt married her high school sweetheart, so my mother has known her brother-in-law since she was 13.
Whoa,
which is kooky to me because I don't talk to anyone that I knew when I was 13, literally except my parents. My grandparents were married for 70 years. Yeah.
Wow.
So
wow.
There is this sense of normalcy about that. Mm-hmm. So, and that is, of course, not everyone's experience. We are all limited by experience. Right. So, it's funny because I am totally a liberal, but I am probably just as canceled as you are in this environment.
We're about to get canceled.
We're pre-canceled. I come pre-canceled.
Pre-canceled. Excellent.
Okay. So, what are we going to talk about?
All right. Well, we'll be getting into Illich, but not yet. Let's get into the 2 articles.
We're not just going to read to you. We want you to be able to read. So where can our readers find these things that we are reading or talking about?
On our Substack, redfems.substack.com, and fingers crossed in the show notes, wherever you're listening to this.
So, first article, this piece appeared in the New York Times last month. It's by a Korean woman named Hwan Jung, who has a new book out. I think it was forthcoming at the time the article ran. It may be out. We have not read it. Called Flowers of Fire, The Inside Story of South Korea's Feminist Movement and What It Means for Women's Rights Worldwide. So the title of the guest essay, as it appeared in the print edition, which I happened to see because I was on a plane and I had a paper, was How to End South Korea's Birth Strike? ? Feminism.
Birth strike. That sounds ominous.
It's totally ominous, yes. South Korean women are no longer having enough children to, keep South Korea in existence. So I'm going to read a quote from the article here. For 3 years in a row, the country has recorded the lowest fertility rate in the world.
Whoa.
With women of reproductive age having fewer than 1 child on average. Mm-hmm. It reached the dead cross, that's an ominous term, that means when deaths outnumbered births in 2020, nearly a decade earlier than expected.
Why are women opting to remain childless?
That is the question, right? So there's an argument about this, and it's taken on these sort of cultural stakes there. The article talks about how the recently elected president, Yoon Suk-yeol, actually got himself elected, arguing that it was feminism that is to blame. But the author of this piece, Young, argues that this is exactly backwards. That South Korea remains too patriarchal, violently chauvinistic, and puts extreme demands on mothers, including discouraging them to work once they have a child. So women are choosing careers over marriage and motherhood. And so there's even a fringe movement, a sort of extreme example of this, with straight women who have taken the pledge to the 4 no's. No dating, no sex, no marriage, and no child rearing.
Wow.
So things are not great.
No. I remember from that article this particularly poignant image of daycare centers and kindergartens are being repurposed to be nursing homes because there literally are not enough children. There's not enough children at the local school to form a soccer team. And it's like, oh my goodness, this is like that book or that movie Children of Men, where there are just no children. I'm like, what is happening?
And that is obviously, in a society where you have no children, you soon don't have a society.
Right.
So, What the heck? I mean, feminism, right? So the author of this piece is like, we need to make it possible for women to balance family and career. We need to make it more appealing. But how can it be that, if you can, let's stipulate that South Korea always had a very patriarchal, possibly from our outsider viewpoint, male chauvinistic culture. Birth rates were not always this low.
Right.
So this is a modern thing brought on by this sort of new, but we're probably going to argue false choice between having success in the economy and children.
Right. I think there's something pathological about a system that sets up women to have to choose, do I want a family and to be married and have kids, or do I want a career? Like, if you have to choose between two good things like that, and with all this sort of acrimony and, I can't say envy, but just like almost like hatred between the sexes, the way it was described, like the names that they would call one another, ugly feminist pigs, and, feminism is a mental disorder, things like that.
Ooh, that's fighting words.
Yeah. Yeah. was really shocking. And I don't, if that's, I don't know, if women feel stuck at home because they're mistreated at home, or they're relegated to the home, then I can see why they would want to opt out. It's weird. It's almost like a modern day, form of like being a monk or a nun, like celibacy almost, like pulling away, but not for the sake of like some transcendental higher good, like worshiping God. It's like for the economy. Like, seriously, like to keep the job, you'd give up all of these things. But it's just sad that that the home would be a place to escape. Well, shame on the men for making home a place they want to get away from. I don't know that opting out is ultimately suicidal, right? For the society. So it can't be, you can't call that good, right? Anything that sort of eats itself alive, right? Like, so that it no longer exists can't be good. So.
Yes, there is a definite dystopian tinge to that idea. That's interesting that you mentioned monasticism, because the article about the Four No's movement that is linked to in that article, I went and read, and they talk about this woman who's a member of this movement, and her dream, at the end of the article, it says her dream is to open housing for a place where women who don't want to marry can live. And I'm like, we did that!
That's called
check! We had that! It's like
monastery.
So part of me feels like there's a poverty of cultural options here, right?
Yes.
Being expressed. I mean, there's two things. One is, and Illich has a lot to say about this, why do women resent home life in the modern economy so much?
Right.
What is that about? That's about something. But the other thing is about, my one of the reasons I chose to remain childless was because I don't believe if you are going to have a kid, you have to raise the kid.
Yeah.
Like,
you got to do it.
Someone has to raise the kid.
Yes.
So if it's not you, you're basically signing someone else up to do that.
Right.
So
you're outsourcing.
You're outsourcing it. That's what we would call it now. I mean, that's a term that is very much a sort of Illich would be like,
it's a keyword. Keywords. Yeah. Sorry.
Because, sorry everybody who has no idea what we're talking about. Because it implies that there's not enough of these things.
That's right. It implies, scarcity of mothers, of maternal involvement?
Scarcity of everything. And that is going to be like, we're going to say that word so much, you're going to be sick of us saying it. But it implies that there is a shortage of this thing called attention or care resources, or so there's clearly a connection between choosing not to have children because there's not enough of something that would make having children easier. And it could be a lot of things. It could be time. It could be respect. It could be whatever. But if we have a society where women, it's just as easy to work if you have children, that means clearly to me that there's only two ways to do that. One is we redefine what work looks like.
Yes.
And like you say, you can do it like you do. Like you do your quote unquote non-child related work in a way that allows you to still do the other thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Or we have this in some ways in our economy already, we have an economy whose sole product is childcare. Like,
oh my goodness.
Like daycare. Like, we have a part of our economy that takes care of the kids, so people can go not take care of their own kids. They can...
Right.
Which is, I mean, I am like that kid. I was like after school care, latchkey kid. I'm that kid. And I have no resentment for my mother wanting to have a career. Like, I feel like that's fine. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it doesn't really scale. Like, to do that. My mother was home with me for my first, 3 years. Like, I joke that she gave me the best gift that I can't remember. Because, she gets no credit. Because I don't remember any of that.
Right.
But until I was... key. From birth to, when I was eligible for, potty trained daycare. Although she totally lied about that. That's a different story.
A mom's got to do what a mom's got to do.
Exactly. But, so, I wasn't in... I mean, but now it's just, you can put an infant in daycare at, 6 months. Not even sometimes.
Yeah.
6 weeks. 8 weeks.
Oh, man. But, I mean, at that point, a mother's body is, still, in symbiosis with the baby. That's to be separate like that for hours upon hours upon hours. I just can't.
And I have a friend who recently had a kid, and she talks about how she's home all the time. Obviously, they're kind of holed away in upstate New York, keeping themselves to themselves. Mm-hmm. And because they were all working remotely, so it wasn't really a big change. But she notices that her young daughter has totally different capacities and attitudes at different times in the day. Huh. So she's describing what we call, especially with people with dementia, sundowning. She says her daughter will sundown. The hours that she's the most awake is the morning. Yes. And so she talks about, imagine what it would be like if you were dropping your infant off at daycare. The only hours you saw your kid, really, you spent was when they were at their worst.
Yeah. It's the witching hour, dinner time onwards. It's that's why falling apart.
I had colic. I cried from 5 to 8 every night for 3 months. So it's not just about the time and a woman working away from her kid. It's about your entire experience of being a parent is changed by that. Because you're not having the same experience of your kid.
Yeah, there's this embodied connection. There's all this juice, I mean, and the hormones that flow between mother and baby and being able to nurse rather than pump and all of that. It's kind of indescribable, and it is kind of magical. I don't know. I feel, and check my privilege again, I feel really grateful that I was in an economic situation where I was able to stay home with my kids and do that. And I mean, it does come with the sort of the hair raising, I'm going crazy, it's also very hard.
Yeah, my mother described it as being very isolating to be alone with a baby because, you can't talk to a baby.
Right.
I mean, you can talk to the baby, but the baby can't, answer something interesting back.
I mean, it's isolating because of the way our societies are structured now that we're not living with, grandmother and aunties and sisters and everybody around who we can pass the baby off to.
We're not in this place where, right next door, or everyone is sort of engaging in this whole thing. I mean, the romanticization of this is going to the well to get the water. Right. You meet all your friends.
Chatting with the ladies, yeah.
Yeah. And we are very, very far apart from that. Yeah. But evolutionarily, mentally, we are not very far away from that.
That's right.
Hmm. So this, as a sort of harbinger feminist, I was equalizing the workplace is not going to solve this problem. No. My gut reaction was, this is backwards. Feminism... Yes, make it possible. It sounds really gross in the way that women are sort of treated as second-class citizens in that culture. Yes. That does sound gross. But even my own experience in the American workplace, which is nowhere near that kind of chauvinistic, has not necessarily been... I think that the idea of fitting women into the workplace as it existed already. I mean, I don't think we give enough credit to the idea that workplace used to be a man's domain.
It still is, even though lots of women are in it.
Yeah, exactly. We just said women and men are the same. Put the women in there. That's right. Party time.
That's right.
And that is no. If we're going to have men and women in the workplace, burn the whole thing down and start over.
Exactly. Oh, high five. Yes.
Because I don't think just accommodating or pretending or I don't think the way that is it's great that anti-harassment laws and all that stuff exists. But I don't think it's sufficient. I think it's looking at the problem upside down. I think, and I also just don't think that I mean, someone has to raise your kids. It's either the person who has them or it's someone who's paid to do so. And I'm just very skeptical. As liberal and bleeding heart liberal as I am, I don't see how the state can do that better. I don't see that. I don't see that as like, I don't know. I'm not, I'm turning into such a conservative in my old age. It's really sad. I'm a liberal conservative. I don't know what I am. I'm politically homeless.
I feel you.
Okay. So, yeah. I just think the way that people, that article, so, okay, main takeaway. For me, that article was like, it was just astonishing to me that there's just still people who think that after 40 years of third wave feminism, that there's something more we can do to tinker with the system of people in the workplace that's going to fix that.
Right. Right. It seemed like it was saying, just throw more feminism at it and it'll get fixed, which to me feels like how people say about education, like just throw more money at it and then it'll be fixed. You're like, no, there's some fundamental flaw and assumption at the core of it that is not working, and just more and more of the same will not fix that. So, yeah, I think one of my fundamental takeaways from it is that when men and women can't get along, what that looks like as a symptom is no babies.
Ah, yeah.
You know, like on that broad level. I'm not talking about on an individual level, but just, you know, they're not doing it. They don't want to do it. And then there's no fruitfulness from it. You know, it's dying on the vine when men and women can't find a way to be together in their difference. They can't find a way to be. Cooperation, not competition.
Yes, and this sense that there isn't something that you're surrendering. Like, I can't have this thing that this man has if I have a kid. I mean, that seems to be like, I don't want these things that are associated with the child. That's whatever, if that's motherhood, if that's marriage. That just seems like the idea that feminism is wanting. If feminism in that context is about getting women to behave like men, then more of it will never bring back having children.
Exactly. Yeah.
To the second article.
Awesome. Let's segue into our next article. This is by my internet girl crush, Mary Harrington. Shout out to Mary Harrington. She's wonderful. She's a writer for the website Unheard, and her piece is a question: is there hope for marriage? On big romance and other myths of the modern age.
I don't think I ever believed in big romance, but so what does Mary define marriage as? I mean, it's obviously my marriage is not my parents' marriage, and it's not my grandparents' marriage either.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. So Mary describes what we call a traditional marriage, the sort of conception of, you know, the angel by the hearth, the wife and the mother presiding over the home, as actually a relatively new byproduct of industrialization. That mode granted women this sort of boon of companionship and intimacy, which is what she calls big romance, but it simultaneously made women more economically dependent on their husbands. So, yeah, you get to marry your soulmate, but now you're much more likely to need him financially than he is to need you, which introduces this power imbalance and a hierarchy that wasn't present in the pre-industrial world of subsistence living.
Oh, we're getting so close to the Illich.
Oh, yeah. So Harrington goes on to just say that big romance is starting to be liquidated because of the effects of new technologies like the pill and the internet that make it possible for women to be functionally interchangeable with men in the workplace and in the home.
She's definitely read Illich.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm going to say.
Oh, for sure. So, you know, this companionate marriage that we're more familiar with is now being replaced by what Harrington calls the self-expressive marriage, which no longer has any place for duty and dependency, whether that's mutual or one-sided, but is really about individual fulfillment and empowerment. But Harrington sees that the self-expressive marriage is it's inherently unstable. You know, there's no center of gravity. It's falling apart. And so she's calling for us to rethink marriage again. She says, but this cannot just be a case of stuffing women back into some imaginary traditional box or seeking the ultimate victory of one sex over the other. Instead, we have to revise again what we understand marriage to mean. Some conservatives suggest that the way we fix this is by returning to the 20th century understanding of marriage, and with it somehow to the traditional relationship between men and women. The weakness of such solutions is not that they are unworkable or even that they are traditional. It is that they are not traditional enough. Today, there is little prospect of reviving the industrial-era housewife as the principal template for sex roles, nor is there need. Under 21st century conditions, the sharp split between home and work that drove the emergence of such roles is blurring again, and the blurring of that divide in turn opens up new possibilities, hinting at a way of viewing lifelong solidarity between the sexes that owes more to the 1450s than the 1950s. It does so by bringing work back into the home, and in the process ramping up the kind of interdependence that can underpin long-term pragmatic solidarity.
That is a genius quote. And she gets so much crap on the internet for being conservative.
But she's not. She's like you.
Yeah, we're all politically homeless now. So if the anti-feminist movement in South Korea, the patriarchal males are like, oh, we need traditional marriage, enough of these feminism, Harrington is like, no, we can't go back to the 1950s.
Right.
So I think it's safe to say that we've got two models that you and I think are both failures. We've got the just pretend it's the 1950s model,
right?
Put women back in the home, and we've got the feminist, just equalize the workplace model, the second wave feminist model of just equalize, and maybe even some of the third wave, like sex work is real work, that kind of like. But you and me are, and we've gotten this, I think, from even Illich, this idea that there is a peel back all of this traditional. So this idea of the big romance where the husband goes and earns the money and is devoted enough to bring it back to his wife, who rules the, and this can go for the 1950s, but even maybe the 1850s.
Yeah.
The idea that it's the devotion that equalizes that fundamental sort of dependency relationship. And of course now if the woman can get a job, she doesn't need the man to have the job. So there's really no motive except maybe like you make me feel good to stay married.
Right.
But Harrington is like, well, that seemingly is not working because look at divorce rates.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting because when I read how she describes, big romance and the sort of this, the man leaves the house and the woman's home and she's dependent on him, like that's the mode in which I grew up in, and that like I was kind of raised in, and like the milieu of like conservative Christianity kind of did that. And like I saw how if you have a good man, it is functional. Like it can work when there's virtue and genuine love present. And so I understand why conservatives would be like, let's go back to that. That's the good old days. Like I get it because it can work for some people, but it isn't really. It doesn't scale very well. And then yeah, when you have the situation where women then leave the house too and are going out, then the whole thing shifts and it's falling apart.
There's a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about next week that I've already started looking into. There is this great sense that not being dependent on a man is essential to liberating women, but depending on how much, or that doesn't. I mean, obviously, to not have to marry to have a living is a good thing. But the thing is, what is the only way to do that? To basically then your boss is your. I mean, I like to talk about how like, if single women, if there's no fathers involved in raising children, then the substitute for the father is essentially the state.
Ugh.
I mean, in the sense that if you can't earn, if you can't earn the money to support yourself and your child, then, and if the old days was that was the father's job to provide for the family.
Right.
Now the new version of that, oh well, the state just pays you. And again, not like I'm against single motherhood, but at scale, it doesn't work. The state is never a substitute. I mean, there's things that the state is good at substituting for, like you could say justice. Like instead of going and killing someone who wrongs you, the state is going to step in and provide that justice for you. Not revenge, but this other thing that we've given up. So it's a trade-off thing, right? And it's the trade-off between not having families who care about the infant, raise the infant, versus just money or something. Feminists seem committed that it is better just to get your money not from a man, but from a company or from the state. And I'm very suspicious of that because I believe in a welfare state, but I don't feel like a welfare state is a culture.
That's a great point, yes.
It's not, I don't feel, I'm just not convinced. Yeah. We both think that this situation of the substitution for some sort of dependency care network is missing, but we both agree it used to be there. Harrington talks about the 1450s. So should we talk about Illich now?
Yeah.
Should we do that?
Let's segue in. So, Yeah, Illich can kind of tell us, like, what the hell happened? How did we get here? So, why don't you
Certainly, he has a version of events, which you are all free to disagree with. But, okay, so we're going to talk about the first chapter of a book that is a collection of essays called Gender. We're going to talk about chapter 1, which is called Sexism and Economic Growth. So, Ivan Illich was born in September of 1926, and he died in December of 2002. He was an Austrian Roman Catholic priest. He actually grew up sort of all over the place. He was a polyglot. He spoke like 7 languages, maybe more.
Whoa.
But he was originally from Austria. He was a theologian, a philosopher, a social critic. He also taught. He's probably best known for his book from 1971 called Deschooling Society, which was a critique about education as an institution. I mean, he was a pretty anti-institutionalist guy in a lot of ways. Despite being part of, like, what we could call one of the most, like,
the oldest living institution.
The church.
The Catholic Church.
He spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico and Mexico. I think we could safely call him an anti-modernist in many ways.
Yeah.
He believed that industrialization, technology, and even the imposition of the ideas in the Gospels as formal law was destroying what he thought of as successful subsistence cultures. We think of subsistence as like, oh, you poor thing, you're poor. But that's... Yeah. Not what you think. You have to sort of blank that from your mind, audience. So this collection of essays that was published as Gender came out of lectures that he was invited to give at UC Berkeley in 1980 and 1981 in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. I think it was probably already Gender Studies at that time. Let's just say that feminists did not appreciate his viewpoint. You might say he got canceled. And in fact, the book kind of destroyed his reputation on the left, because a lot of the things he was doing were not just saying, oh, you women, you're never going to get economic equality, blah, blah, blah. A lot of his ideas, just in a broader sense, relate to this. And in fact, this book was the last of his to appear from a major publisher. So it's all there in the opening lines of the first essay of this collection. So, industrial society creates 2 myths. One about the sexual ancestry of this society, and the other about its movement towards equality. Both myths are unmasked as lies of humans, which he italicizes, who belong to the, quote, second sex. So, the second sex, that ring any bells?
Simone de Beauvoir.
Yes, that's the title of her book from 1949. The famous line that it begins with is, one is not born a woman, one becomes one. There's a whole host of things we could unpack in there. But basically, Illich is saying that second wave feminists, the critique at the heart of it is based on an idea that is not historically true. Because what that, the second sex is this idea that says, like, women have always been oppressed. Gender is the form of that oppression. Sex is the basis of that oppression. So he's saying, no, that's crap, because sex didn't always exist. And he's saying, by the way, this new state of sex-based oppression cannot be fixed. It is irremediable.
That's dark.
It's like super dark. They were pissed. So if society didn't have this so when he italicizes humans there, he's saying human is what gives us the idea of, if you start from a human, you can say this human has this sex and this human has this other sex, and that's where you get male and female. And we just think that's like normal, that's biological. But Illich says instead, he says that's modern. What we used to have was something called gender. I bet everybody's thoroughly confused, because when he says gender, you can't think of what we think it means and all the disagreements about it. You have to just, like, erase your mind. Read us this second quote. What does Illich mean when he says gender?
I use gender, then, in a new way to designate a duality that in the past was too obvious even to be named, and is so far removed from us today that it is often confused with sex.
So, what the heck does that mean? A duality. So this is meaning something that exists in its natural state as 2 parts.
It's assumed throughout the whole Bible of, like, heaven and earth, and man and woman, and the whole dynamic of the Bible is is like the union of heaven and earth being this fruitful thing, and the beautiful. Yes, it's yin and yang. It is that thing it's metaphorical, symbolic, poetic, and is so obvious that it went without saying. It was something people lived in. It was not it was not scientific at all. That's not how it was viewed at all.
If you do a lot of feminism, maybe the term to oppose duality here would be a binary. Right, so you know how critical theory is all about disrupting the binary. So duality is the opposite of a binary, because a duality can never. A duality doesn't have a hierarchical relationship.
Right.
It has an asymmetrical relationship, and it doesn't. So there isn't like a one is oppressor, one is oppressed, and we are so used to that language and that thinking. Right. So gender is a state of affairs that has a way of acknowledging difference that has no relationship to the way that we think differences does always indicate some sort of hierarchy.
Right. Or competition. Right. They're not polarized in a, this side versus that side. That's not at all what's happening. It's like there's two fundamentally different, I guess equal, but like there's two fundamentally different ways of being in the world. And they're kind of incommensurable with one another. They're not interchangeable. And they both are sort of holistic in their own right, but together they sort of form the whole world.
Yes. Because, the Genesis created them male and female, meaning like they were created as distinct, but they were created together.
Right.
Together but distinct.
Yes. As unity and diversity, or unity and multiplicity together.
So, okay, so here's the quote 3. So that's a little deeper of what he means. I have adopted this term, that is gender, to designate a distinction in behavior, a distinction universal in vernacular cultures. It distinguishes places, times, tools, tasks, forms of speech, gestures, and perceptions that are associated with men from those associated with women. This association constitutes social gender because it is specific to a time and place. I call it vernacular gender because this set of associations is as peculiar to a traditional people, in Latin agens, that's the root of the word in English gender, as is their vernacular speech. So the feminists out there who are obviously have already stopped listening, but to the ones who are still there, this just sounds like, stereotypes, men have to do something, women have to do something, everybody has to, it sounds like conformity. But it's not, I don't read it like that.
No, because what he goes on to describe later in the book is that the sense of gender, it's not universalized. So you could have like some little hamlet in 14th century France or something, and the way that that their women and their men lived would be distinct and different from how over in the next valley, how that community had their men and their women be. And so there was always this juicy and delicious difference between men and women in all of the different little local places. But if you compared one local place to another, they were different, like languages, like dialects, like food, like music, right? Like there's not some sort of like this big box universal system that applies to all men everywhere and all women everywhere. It was always our men, our women. And so it's not stereotypical because it's not universalized, and yet the distinction is always maintained.
My classic story about that is he talks about this book in one point in, what was it, like, I guess we could say 18th century France, that if you didn't have a woman in your life, you couldn't wash your clothes or mend your clothes.
Yeah, he says you could like smell a bachelor a mile off, because he would stink, and he couldn't, all his clothes would have holes, and he'd be falling to pieces because he had no woman to care for him, because he literally couldn't.
Because those things were not. I was trying to explain the power of what we could call, when I use, like, we're going to say gender in the Illich sense, this sort of deep-seated sense of, realms of subsistence living. So like laundry or food or farming or whatever. I was trying to explain this to a friend of mine, just be like how powerful gender used to be, and she's like, I was like, can you imagine what it would be like to like just to live outside this would mean that you were deprived of things like laundry.
Right.
And she says to me, I don't want to do my husband's laundry. And I was like, oh my God,
you're not getting
so hard to explain. Like, this is a fail.
Right.
Because that is the attitude of like, well, everyone can do everything. So why should I do something for someone? See, that's the level at which most people think when they hear places, times, tools, tasks, forms of speech. that one set of those belongs to women and one set belongs to men, they think, why should I do a man's laundry?
Right.
And it's really hard to get down there.
Or like, why are they keeping me away from their tools? I want to use the man's tools. Like, why can't, there's this sort of competitive, it's envy, right? Like, it's an envy that seems to only go one way. It's the women envying the men, which is this assumption that the whatever it is that the women have is not really worth anything. And I think that, like, that Bachelor example, demonstrates the older world, men and women mutually depended on each other. That the men needed the women just as much as the women needed the men.
Yes.
And so with industrialization, with the men going out and then the women becoming dependent, the men didn't need them anymore to quite the same degree.
Well, maybe they needed them, but the things that the women were portrayed as doing had somehow been diminished.
Yes.
By so there's two things going on here. One is the division of what we might call labor. Although, again, like, subsistence living is not labor. It's the effect of Illich. This is what Illich talks about, right? It's the effect of this kind of replacement, labor for money in a society where your goods where you were buying most of the things you were living with, like you were dependent on consumption. Mm-hmm. That represents a fundamental change that somehow, always left women with the short end of the stick. So,
yes.
So we have this, like, it's really hard to access the idea of gender. But I think the definition, if we contrast it with the definition of sex, it might make more sense. Can you read quote number 4 for us?
Yeah. By sex, I mean the result of a polarization in those common characteristics that, starting with the last 18th century, are attributed to all human beings. Unlike vernacular gender, which always reflects an association between a dual, local, material culture and the men and women who live under its rule, social sex is, small c, Catholic. It polarizes the human labor force, libido, character, or intelligence, and is the result of a diagnosis, in Greek discrimination, of deviations from the abstract, genderless norm of the human. Sex can be discussed in the unambiguous language of science. Gender bespeaks a complementarity that is enigmatic and asymmetrical. Only metaphor can reach for it.
So that is a beautiful quote, and it bears some thinking about. So this idea that humans were all sort of cut from the same cloth, and we just have these differences. The way to think about this might be like those personality tests, where, like, we're all human, but women tend to be more agreeable than men. Women tend to be more neurotic, this is, of course, in the aggregate, than men. Right. But that whole paradigm is assuming that we're all human, and then we just have on a slider, just give, we have, slide this, slide that. It's like, adjust a photo filter, like, we're just sort of, we all start from the same ingredients. We just have more or less of them.
Or like variations on a theme.
Yes.
Like fundamentally same. Like, or like this sort of androgynous thing until you add or subtract little features here and there.
Yes.
Like, no, that's weird. That's a new way to think.
It's modern, yes.
It's modern, yeah.
But of course, like, this is why second wave feminism hits this wall, because in order to gain access to things like suffrage or the workplace, it requires, I mean, if men believe that, math was bad for women because they have uteruses, then you gotta, like, downplay some of those things. You have to say, like, this understanding, this, what Illich calls the loss of gender, this genderless framework, actually, in some senses, forwards that mission to say, oh, we're not fundamentally different. We can do math. But especially here, it's worth noting, what's that guy's name? Carl Trueman, is it? I want to say, who just wrote that book. Yep. He talks a lot about how this this idea that a human being is just sort of like it's like, it's like choosing your character in a video game.
Yes!
Right? You start with some sort of basic framework, and then you add a little more aggression, a little more libido, a little less honesty, whatever, a little more or less intelligence. It's this idea that expressive individualism takes its root from. This idea that we are all, fundamentally, all human beings are sort of, it's where we get the concept of human rights. Mm-hmm. you can't have human rights if you come at it from this duality of like, there's no concept of everybody being in the same bucket.
Right.
With Illich's gender.
Yeah.
Like so there are no human rights. And that's a weird thing to say because we have this attitude that, well, that's bogus. Like, you can't have, you're against human rights. Right. It sounds very sort of inflammatory. Mm-hmm. But what it means is it's just this basic, a fundamental assumption that most modern people have. Even, I would say, conservatives on some level.
Yeah.
But especially liberals, that there's this sort of sameness at the bottom. We're all just human. And that's been used in a lot of, and rightfully so, this has been used in a lot of civil rights language.
Right. It has a practical meaning, and it's played a part in some really good changes.
Right.
So it's not like we're saying, like, get rid of that, that's terrible.
Right.
Right. But there is sort of a useful fiction element to it, because it's kind of like saying human is kind of like saying, think of a generic hand. Not a right hand or a left hand.
That's
hand.
A great example.
You're like, well, 2 thumbs? No thumb? Like, what do you mean? Right. Like, the hands come in right or left. Like, I mean, you can say hand, but, you really kind of assume probably your dominant hand. Or, like, they really, it's right and left hand, And so I think gender is really
what Illich says that he means, when you say men and women, when you say gender, you say a culture that has both. And it cannot be other than that.
Right. Let's look at the linchpin of Illich's critique, which is the connection between capitalism and sex distinction.
Okay, so here's quote number 5. I oppose the regime of scarcity to the reign of gender. I argue that the loss of vernacular gender is the decisive condition for the rise of capitalism and a lifestyle that depends on industrially produced commodities. Scarcity is his word for industrial capitalism.
Okay.
I think the best way to think of it is gender is a relationship between men and women, but it also is constitutive of a way of producing the things for life.
Yes.
It has the characteristic of not having the effect that industrialization, that the commodity-based cultures have, or economies have, which is that idea of, because if you're dependent on a product, it automatically means that you can run out of it. So a gender-based subsistence living world, you cannot run out of something like care or food. I mean, obviously there can be a famine and everybody can die, but it's not the same as like, I can't buy enough blah because of whatever.
Right.
The economics of capitalism is so dependent on supply and demand and growth.
Yes.
Right? And so growth in a gender regime is sort of the reign of gender. It's like, it's all just sort of like baked in. It just works. Mm-hmm. And he talks a lot about that in the book. We don't have time to go really into how that is. Once it's all about goods and services, there's always the chance that there's never enough. Plus, and then so the effect of that on when gender goes away, not only do you lose that enoughness, you get this idea that the labor force consists of humans who are interchangeable.
Right, like parts of a machine.
Yes.
Yep.
So you get a unisex culture, is what he calls this. Here's quote number 6. The subject on which economic theory is based is just such a genderless human. Then, with scarcity accepted, the unisex postulate spreads. Every modern institution, from school to family and from union to courtroom, incorporates this assumption of scarcity, thereby dispersing its constitutive unisex postulate throughout the society. For example, men and women have always grown up. Now they need education to do so. Thus, education turns into the name for learning to live under an assumption of scarcity. It assumes the scarcity of a genderless value. It teaches that he or she who experiences its process is primarily a human being in need of genderless education. Economic institutions, then, are based on the assumption of scarcity and genderless values, equally desirable or necessary for competing neuters belonging to 2 biological sexes.
Oof, that line. Competing neuters.
Yes.
Oh,
so they're linked for him, right? It's both that they're linked for him. It's the economic competition goes hand in hand with the loss of gender, with this idea of like a neutered human being. So why do you think the feminists are mad at him?
Yeah, it's a completely different way of viewing what humans are, what they're like.
That was what second wave feminism said. It shouldn't matter whether you are a man or a woman. You should be able to have an equal outcome in the economy. And Illich talks a lot about in the second chapter, which is called Economic Sex, how this has not been made manifest. And he's writing in the 1980s.
Right.
But he's already said in the 1980s, this is hopeless, women.
Yeah, because he's saying that sexism isn't a bug of society, it's a feature. So if we're going to have society set up the way it is, with capitalism the way it is, the kind of sexism that, that feminism is against, it will always be here. We can't just try to have more feminism to make it go away. It's like the whole system is geared to create South Korea doing what it's doing, right? Like that's like the natural sad outcome of this sort of competitive, acrimonious dynamic between the sexes.
Right. He says the pursuit of a non-sexist economy is absurd as a sexist one is abhorrent. Relentlessly, economic institutions transform the two culturally embedded genders into something new, into economic neuters distinguished by nothing more than their disembodied sex. Economic discrimination against women cannot exist without the abolition of gender and the social construction of sex. So he's saying, basically, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Why do we like this? Why do we find this informative? How can we defend him maybe against this notion of gender as just putting women back in the kitchen?
Yeah, I definitely don't think he's trying to put women back in the kitchen. I think he's trying to, in a sense, give the history of the kitchen. Like, the kitchen today is not the kitchen of yore. They're completely different.
Right.
And so what it's like to be a woman in the kitchen, centuries ago versus a woman in the kitchen now, it's a totally different experience. Not necessarily because women have changed, but because the whole setting and the meaning of kitchen or home, or because we don't have productive households anymore, we have consuming households.
Yes.
And that changes everything. To be the queen of the place of consumption is not the same thing as being as presiding over this productive land and home in which you're cooperating with your husband.
Very well said.
So, history of the kitchen. That's what
Right. And in fact, if you've heard of the term shadow work, he made up that term. He had some help, but he wrote a book, in fact, on it, and he talks about shadow work a lot. And that's shadow work is what you do to a commodity you purchase to make it useful. And so that process, if we think of the 50s housewife,
yes,
going to the store, making the food, that is a process that largely consists of shadow work, in the sense that you start with things that are these consumables, and you go from there. So not only do you have the obligation to surrender, someone has to surrender their labor for a wage. Mm-hmm. Then you have to make the things that you buy with that money useful to live. So
right.
It's 2 steps removed from
yes.
subsistence culture.
And that shadow work does not require the same skill or have the same status as what, women were doing, in the older kitchens, right? Like, it's unisex work is what he says. Like, anybody could do it. And it made me think of this example. I had heard that this is probably the 50s era thing of buy a box of cake mix, just add water, and then women can make their cake, right? That women weren't buying that because they felt guilty about how easy it was, right? Because there's a sense of this just is a product. I don't want to show this cake to my husband. I didn't even work for it. And so the marketers were smart, and they tapped into this sort of shame that women had about shadow work being too easy. And they're like, well, add an egg, egg plus water. And then it tricked the women into feeling like, I'm really doing something now, and so then they would buy them because it was just add an egg. But I feel it's sort of like a sad, example of industrial capitalism got us again, but it has this feeling of we know, there was a reason why Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, and why women were bored and miserable in the 1950s kitchen and didn't know, and were straightening the corners of the towels because they had nothing else to do, right? That's legit, that feeling, and it's because of shadow work. It's not because the home is inherently a bad place, or being a wife or a mother is bad, or that everybody should go out to work.
So to come back to the article in the South Korean birth strike article, it's about scarcity, right? The government is concerned about a scarcity of people.
Yes.
And it's worth noting that it was the state itself that originally encouraged lowering the birth rate because they wanted to economic numbers, right? So if you can improve per capita wealth by having fewer heads, right? So as late as the 1960s in South Korea, women had 6 children on average.
Whoa.
So it was the state that, pursuing economic development goals carried out an aggressive population control campaign. And so in 20 years, women were having fewer than the 2.1 on average children needed for replenishment. So if women aren't having kids because they feel the lack of resources, time, money, respect, Illich would say that no amount of economic tinkering can solve a problem that is baked into a regime of scarcity.
Yes.
That's the trick, right?
That's right.
He would say that the only way to reduce sexism, which we calls, I think at one point, a new form of degradation under the regime of scarcity. Oof. I like that. Would be to, in fact, disengage from the goods and services-based economy. So if you're trying to have enough means that you're not going to have kids, because if it's like scarcity, that those two things don't mesh. Degrowth would be then, and he's talking about degrowth in the 80s, which is kind of like prescient because there's a big move about that. Yes, because he believes that industrial capitalism produces a consumption-dependent producer who isn't necessarily sexist. So in this context, Harrington is important because she's saying we can look at marriage a different way.
Yeah, and she, interviews various people for her article where they're describing what their home life is like. And I was reading, I was like, oh my gosh, I think this is my life. Like, right. The husband works from home, kind of like Zoom class type of thing. And the wife is at home with kids, and she's got like some little side thing on the side, but she enjoys like making stuff out of her home. And she doesn't experience being in her home as shadow work. Like, even though it might kind of look like the same thing, it might even be the same exact like motions that she's doing. The women that she interviews do not feel oppressed, burdened, stifled by it. They have the sense of agency, partly because the husband is home and the children are there, and like everyone is kind of pitching in. It's like it's turned from a site of consumption into a site of productivity and conviviality, and it has a center of gravity to it, kind of gathered around the table. Like it's a different kind of home. Yes, conviviality. Illich also wrote a book, Tools for Conviviality. He was big on that. And that's it's a really old idea, conviviality. Probably due for a reboot. What are we doing next week? Housekeeping. I mean, podcast housekeeping, not shadow work housekeeping. That's right. That's right. I cannot remember the name of it, but I know it involves Maya Forstetter. Yes. Oh, yeah. No, I think I called it something glib, like when the call is coming from inside the house. Yes. Like in a horror film. Yeah. The enemy within. We're going to talk about a recent disagreement in feminism. All right. Red Femmes. Red Femmes. It's a wrap. It's a wrap. Thanks for joining us. Bye, Acton. Bye, George.